Elena hadn't stepped foot in her grandmother's old seaside house for nearly 7 years. It had once been a place of warmth, of vanilla-scented cookies, and the echo of laughter down the halls. But after her grandmother passed, the house felt like a memory she wasn't ready to revisit. Now, standing at the doorway with the sea breeze brushing against her face and the scent of salt and old wood in the air, she realized how much time had passed. Dust covered everything. The floors creaked under her cautious steps. But it was the attic that called to her most. The one place she'd always been told to stay out of as a child. Something about it had felt sacred, hidden. Her grandmother used to say, "The attic keeps what the heart can't carry," though Elena never understood what that meant, until now. She climbed the narrow staircase, heart fluttering with a mix of fear and curiosity. The attic was dim, only a single beam of sunlight slipping through a cracked window pane. Boxes were stacked like forgotten chapters of a life she'd only partly known. And then she saw it. An old cedar chest with a rusted latch tucked beneath a faded quilt. She knelt beside it, brushing away years of dust, and slowly opened the lid. The smell that escaped was oddly familiar. Lavender, old letters, and something that smelled like the past. Inside was a bundle of papers, brittle with time, and a single envelope resting on top. It was sealed with a deep red wax stamp bearing the delicate imprint of a flower. Her heart caught in her throat when she saw the handwriting. It was unmistakably her grandmother's. Curving, graceful script that read, "For when you're ready to remember love." Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, weathered and curled at the edges. The image showed a man she didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, his jawline rough with stubble, and his eyes shadowed but intense, like he had seen too much of the world and was still standing anyway. He wasn't smiling in the way people usually do in photos. His expression was softer, more vulnerable, as though whoever was behind the camera meant everything to him. But it was the creature beside him that made Elena gasp. A horse, enormous, almost impossibly so, stood with a wild, noble stance. Its coat was dark as the ocean during a storm, and its mane billowed like smoke in the wind. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the image, something that made Elena whisper aloud without thinking, "I've never seen one that size before." It wasn't just the size of the horse that struck her. It was the feeling the photo gave her, like a door had opened to a story she had never been told but somehow already belonged to. She turned the photo over and found more of her grandmother's handwriting. "Find him. Some loves don't die. They wait." Elena's heart beat louder in her chest. She had never known her grandmother to be dramatic or mysterious. She was a woman of reason, of steady hands and garden flowers. But this was something different. It was a secret tucked inside an attic, waiting for Elena to be old enough, heard enough, or maybe brave enough to hear it. As she sat there on the attic floor, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the beams, Elena felt a pull she couldn't explain. Whoever the man was in that photo, whatever story had begun so long ago, something inside her needed to finish it. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where to start. But what she did know was simple and terrifying. She had to go. And just like that, her heart began to remember love. Elena's journey to the island felt like something out of an old story. Part dream, part daring. The clues left behind by her grandmother were faint, almost fragile. Just a small scribbled map on the back of the photograph, and a name whispered in the margins of a torn letter. Calder. She didn't even know if he was still alive. But something inside her, maybe the same thing that made her open the attic chest, kept her moving forward. After a 2-hour ferry ride to a quiet island off the coast of Nova Scotia, she stepped onto the rocky shore, her suitcase in one hand and a storm of questions in her heart. The locals were kind but wary when she asked about Calder. He doesn't talk much, they said, keeps to himself, lives by the cliffs. They called him the Whisperer, not because he spoke softly, but because he rarely spoke at all, unless it was to the horses. Elena followed a dirt trail past meadows and pine trees until she found the cottage. It was small, weather-worn, and nestled near the edge of a cliff that overlooked the roaring sea. There was something poetic about it, something heartbreakingly still. That's when she saw the horse from the photograph. Even more magnificent in person, Branwen moved with a quiet pride, her coat shimmering in the light like wet ink. She stood in the tall grass, unmoved by Elena's presence, almost as if she'd been expecting her. And then Calder appeared. He was older than in the photo, his hair a little longer, his eyes more tired. But there was no mistaking him. He had the same quiet gravity, the same unreadable expression. His gaze met hers like thunder meets sky, sudden, distant, and full of a storm that hadn't yet passed. "I'm looking for answers," Elena said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Calder studied her for a long moment before replying with only 6 words. "Then ask the right questions first." It wasn't what she expected, but something in his tone, gentle, cautious, kept her from turning away. She stayed nearby, renting a room at a tiny inn in the village. Every morning, she would walk back to the cliffside just to see him work with the horses. He spoke to them without words, using calm gestures and long silences. Elena noticed how the horses responded to his presence, not out of fear but out of trust, and slowly, very slowly, Calder started to let her in. She learned little things at first, that Branwen had been rescued, wild and near death, that the island was the only place Calder felt peace, and that he still, somehow, wasn't at peace. He would talk about the horses but not about himself, not about the photograph, not about her grandmother. Elena sensed that something haunted him, something more than just time or solitude. It wasn't until a week had passed that she caught him staring at the sea one evening, the wind playing with his hair, his eyes full of something both sharp and soft. She stood beside him without speaking, waiting. Finally, he said quietly, "Some ghosts don't rattle chains. They just live in your silence." He didn't say who he meant. But Elena knew then that Calder wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding from a wound. The kind that never quite stops bleeding. The strange thing was, the more she learned about him, the more she realized she wasn't just chasing her grandmother's story anymore. She was becoming part of it. Calder fascinated her, not because he was mysterious, but because he was honest in a way most people aren't. Even in his silence, he felt real, raw, and in his presence, her own heart started to remember what it was like to long for something again, not safety, not answers, but connection. The quiet between them had begun to soften. Each day, Elena noticed small shifts. Calder standing a little closer, asking about her past, offering her a mug of coffee without a word. Their silences started to feel less like walls and more like shared understanding. Still, she could sense there was something heavy pressing on him, a weight he carried like a second skin. He never spoke about love, never mentioned her grandmother, and never hinted at why he seemed caught between the present and a memory. Then one night, after a long day helping him tend to the horses, the wind picked up and a chill settled over the island. They sat near the fire inside his cabin, the only sound the quiet crackle of burning wood. Elena asked him if he'd ever loved someone in the way that didn't go away, even after time tried to sweep it under. For a long time, Calder didn't respond. His eyes were distant, staring into the fire as if it could swallow him whole. Then he said a name, so quietly she almost missed it. Ivy. The way he said it told Elena everything. She wasn't just a memory. She was a wound. Calder told the story slowly, like he was peeling back old layers of skin, each one more tender than the last. Ivy had come to the island 5 years ago. A traveler, a storm chaser, a woman who believed the wildest places in the world were the ones most worth loving. Calder had fallen for her fast, deeply, in the way that changes a man. She'd tamed not only the horses, but something in him too. For a while, they had built a life. Quiet, honest, full of hope. And then, one morning after a storm, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, just the open sea and the aching stillness of her absence. At first, Calder believed she would come back. Then, after weeks turned into months, the village started to whisper that Ivy must have drowned. The sea, they said, had claimed her. But Calder never believed that. Not entirely. Deep down, he thought she had run. That she had feared the closeness, or the love, or something inside herself. He had spent years searching for answers, then more, years trying not to want them anymore. She left, he said quietly, but the space she filled didn't. Elena listened, her heart tight. It was clear that Ivy still lived in every part of him. She was the reason he avoided the village, the reason he looked at the horizon like it still owed him something. And as Elena sat there beside him, her feelings tangled in silence, she realized something both beautiful and cruel. She was falling for a man who was still in love with a ghost. She should have packed her things. She should have told herself that some stories don't leave room for a new chapter. But instead she stayed. She helped him care for Branwen, learned how to read the shifts in the wind before a storm, and started to share pieces of her own story. The loneliness that had followed her since her grandmother's passing. The feeling that she was always waiting for something unnamed. Calder didn't push her away, but he didn't pull her close either. They existed in a fragile in-between, where every glance meant more than it should, and every touch lingered just a little too long. Some days, Elena believed he might be reaching for her. Other days, she wondered if he was only reaching through, her to someone else. But something deeper than hope kept her there. Maybe it was the way Calder looked at the sea like it still owed him closure. Maybe it was the way Branwen let her closer than any other horse ever had. Or maybe it was the simple truth that love doesn't always come when the heart is ready. It often comes to make it ready. The storm came without warning, like most things that change everything. One moment the sky was a gentle gray. The next, it darkened into something restless and alive. Elena had been brushing Branwen in the pasture when the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. The horse lifted her head sharply, ears twitching, sensing what was coming before any human could. Calder came running from the stable, his expression tight, not just with concern, but something else. Fear. It wasn't just the weather that troubled him. He didn't speak, just grabbed Branwen's reins and led her toward the shelter. Elena followed without question, heart pounding, the wind growing wilder by the second. The air felt thick with electricity, not just in the sky but in the space, between them, like the island itself was bracing for something long buried to surface. And then she saw it, through the trees, just beyond the cliffs. A figure. A woman. Drenched from the rain, stumbling, as if caught between flight and collapse. Calder stopped cold. His breath hitched. And in the quietest, most broken voice Elena had ever heard, he whispered, "Ivy." Time fractured. The woman looked older, her face worn by time and pain, but unmistakably, it was her. Ivy. The ghost had come back to life. Calder ran to her, wrapped her in his arms like a man drowning, and Ivy collapsed against him, sobbing. Elena stood frozen, unable to move, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand. She should have felt relief. Calder's torment had an end now. But all she felt was the slow unraveling of something she hadn't even realized had grown so deep inside her. Ivy's words were scattered, broken between sobs. She hadn't drowned. She hadn't run away from love. She had run because of fear. Fear of becoming a mother. Fear of staying still. She had found out she was pregnant just days before the storm, and in her panic, she had left without telling Calder. She had stayed, with her sister in a small town inland, raising the child alone, watching the waves from a distance, but never stepping near them. "I didn't think I could be enough," she said, her voice cracking. "Not for you. Not for her." Calder held her tighter, as if afraid she would vanish again. The truth hung between them like rain-soaked cloth, heavy, wrinkled with sorrow. Elena turned away quietly, the wind pulling at her coat, at her breath. She walked back to the cottage without saying goodbye, without knowing what she was supposed to feel. Jealousy, grief. She wasn't sure. She only knew that something had shifted beyond repair. She had come chasing a memory her grandmother had left behind, but somehow she had written her own. And now it was over. Calder had his closure. He had the woman he'd loved all along. And Elena was just the space between their beginning and their return. That night, she packed her things in silence. The cottage felt unfamiliar again, like it belonged to someone else. Outside, the storm had calmed, but inside, her chest felt like it was still being torn apart by wind and water. She told herself it was right this way, that Calder and Ivy had a story long before she arrived, and she was never meant to stay. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the storm had brought more than just Ivy. It had brought a reckoning. And the next morning, the sea would take something back. The morning after the storm was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that makes you nervous, like the world is holding its breath. Elena stood at the edge of the dock with her suitcase beside her, watching the sea stretch out in every direction, endless and calm, as if it hadn't just shaken the world hours before. She hadn't slept. All night, her mind had wrestled with everything. Calder's embrace with Ivy, the truth of what they'd lost, and the aching, quiet way her own heart had started to close itself off again. She'd written Calder a note, just to thank you. Nothing dramatic. She couldn't stay where she was no longer needed, no matter how deeply she had wanted to be. But as she waited for the morning ferry, something unsettled stirred in the village. A man from the coast came running, his voice breathless and sharp. "There's a horse loose on the cliffs!" Branwen. Elena's blood ran cold. She dropped everything and ran, faster than she thought she could, boots thudding against the wet earth, lungs burning, heart slamming against her ribs. The villagers followed, but Elena got there first. Branwen was near the edge, hooves skidding on the wet rocks, her muscles tense and wild with fear. Ivy stood a few feet away, frozen, trying to call to the horse but unsure how to reach her. Calder was nowhere in sight. Elena didn't hesitate. She had helped raise Branwen's trust over weeks, speaking to her not just with words but with presence, patience. Now she stepped forward, palms open, whispering the way Calder had taught her. "It's okay. It's me. You're safe." But Branwen's eyes were wide, panicked. She backed up, too close to the edge. Elena took one more step, slow and steady. And then something slipped. A stone gave way beneath Branwen's back hoof. For a split second, Elena thought she'd fall. Without thinking, she lunged forward, grabbed the reins, and pulled with everything she had. The horse bucked, fought her, but somehow, miraculously, they both stumbled backward, away from the cliff's mouth. The villagers gasped. Ivy ran forward to help steady the horse. Elena fell to her knees in the grass, shaking, wet, and exhausted. By the time Calder arrived, it was over. Branwen was safe. Ivy was shaken, but unharmed. And Elena was different. She stood up slowly, and when Calder rushed to her, she didn't let herself hope. Not this time. "She ran because of me," Ivy said softly, stepping closer. She remembered the last time I disappeared. She didn't trust that I'd stay. Calder looked at Elena then, really looked at her, not with gratitude, but with a kind of quiet devastation. Because he understood finally what he hadn't before. Love isn't just about who returns, it's about who stays. Ivy had come back, but she was still running, still unsure. Elena had every reason to leave, but she had stayed anyway, risked everything for the one thing that wasn't even hers. "I thought the water took her," Calder whispered later, when they stood alone by the shore. "But it took something else. It took the idea that what we lost could ever come back the same." Elena looked at him, unsure what to say. The wind brushed her face. The water shimmered with secrets. "Maybe it's not supposed to," she said. "Maybe it comes back different, and we decide if we can love it that way." Calder reached for her hand then, not with certainty, but with honesty. He didn't promise anything. He didn't offer forever. But in that single gesture, Elena felt something shift, something choose her. The sea hadn't just taken something. It had returned something too. The truth. In the weeks that followed, everything seemed quieter, but not in the lonely way it used to be. The sea still whispered through the rocks, the horses still stirred at dawn, and Calder's footsteps still echoed on the worn paths. But something had changed. Something had softened. Ivy didn't stay. She left again, not with drama or anger, but with the kind of goodbye that finally felt honest. She had come back seeking redemption, maybe even closure, but the island no longer held the roots she once needed. Calder didn't stop her this time. He held her hands, kissed her forehead, and let her go with a tenderness that only years of aching could bring. Ivy's daughter never came to the island. Calder never asked to meet her. That part of the story, Elena understood, belonged to another world, one that didn't need to overlap with this one. And as Ivy disappeared down the winding path, into the fairy's soft morning mist, it felt like the sea had exhaled for the first time in years. Elena stayed. Not because Calder asked her to, and not because there was nothing else waiting beyond the island, but because something within her had finally stopped running. The island, with all its salt and shadow, had become something more than a place. It had become a promise. Calder was still Calder, quiet, careful, a man who didn't speak unless his words mattered. But slowly, he began to reach for her, not in bursts of passion, but in everyday things. A hand on her lower back as she passed him in the stable. A second cup of tea, already steeping by the time she woke. A scarf folded neatly on her chair when the mornings turned colder. These gestures spoke louder than declarations ever could. Their love wasn't rushed or loud. It was built slowly, like the sea reshaping the shore, wave by wave, moment by moment. And in that quiet rhythm, Elena found something she had never known before. Safety, without boredom. Depth, without confusion. Some nights they sat by the fire, shoulder to shoulder, not needing to speak. Other nights, he would read aloud from the worn leather journals her grandmother had once kept, pages filled with observations about the horses, the tides, and sometimes, scattered between the margins, poetry about love. Love that waited, love that forgave, love that echoed. Calder once whispered that he saw the same light in Elena that he had once seen in her grandmother, the same fierce softness, the same way of carrying both joy and pain, without letting either destroy her. Elena didn't answer. She just reached for his hand, their fingers weaving together in a silence fuller than words. There were no grand endings, no perfect sunsets or symphonies, just small, beautiful things. The way Branwen would rest her head against Elena's shoulder. The way Calder would sometimes look at her when she wasn't looking, as though trying to memorize something he never wanted to forget. The way the sea stopped feeling like a thief and instead became a companion, one that had taken much, but also returned what truly mattered. Love, Elena learned, isn't always about who comes crashing in. Sometimes, it's about who quietly stays when the storms have passed. And in the soft, steady days that followed, she realized she hadn't just found Calder. She had found a part of herself she didn't know she had been missing. Not the girl who went searching for answers, but the woman who knew how to live inside the questions. And that was how it ended. Not with a closing, but with a beginning. With a story that didn't need to be perfect, only real. One that would echo softly and surely through every heart that still believed in the beauty of what stays.